The sun had barely crested the red rock ridge when I heard them hoofbeats light and frantic, like an animal running on its last strength. No one rode this far into the high country without a reason, and I could tell these steps carried desperation. Across the shimmering heat, a small pony broke from the scrubbed ribs, showing its flanks streaked with dust and sweat. Two children clung bareback to its withers, swaying with each staggering step. They didn't make it to the fence. The first slid off into the dirt limp. The second tumbled moments later, and I caught her just before her head struck the ground. Both were too light in my arms, their skin hot and dry, their lips cracked. They tried to speak, but only one word made it through Mama before their eyes closed. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever been faced with a choice you knew would change everything. My name is Calter Vane. Folks in town don't know much about me anymore, and I keep it that way. I built my place myself, stone on the bottom pine, above tucked against a red rock bluff, where the wind cuts sharp in winter and the summer sun bleaches everything it touches. I was a scout in the war, riding under Captain Lang in Kansas before the fighting pulled me south to the Texas line. My rifle never missed when it mattered. But when the war ended and my brother's name was read among the dead, I turned my back on the noise and came here. 6 miles from any marked trail, I found the quiet. I thought I needed a mule in the pen beans in the ground and the kind of stillness that keeps a man from hearing what he's lost. I was raised to work steady and keep my word. My father taught me that a man's worth wasn't measured in dollars, but in how he treated his neighbors, whether he showed up when trouble came. My mother believed in the Sabbath and clean clothes on Sunday, and in the idea that even in the hardest seasons, we could offer something to someone else, a warm meal, a place to rest. That was before the railroads carved through the valleys and land speculators started measuring every acre and coin. Out here, you made do with less, kept things mended, and you didn't owe a cent to anyone if you could help it. For years, I kept my distance from the changes. I stopped riding into town, except for salt and coffee. I didn't shake hands, didn't trade stories, didn't let anyone cross my fence line. That distance kept the world's troubles from finding me, or so I thought. But trouble doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it rides in small and quiet, falling into your hands before you've had time to decide what to do about it. When I laid those 2 little girls on my bed and saw the raw rope burns on their wrists, the bruises up their arms, I knew they hadn't come by accident. Someone had sent them, and someone else had taken what mattered most to them. They had made it to me, but whoever they were running from was still out there. I hadn't picked up my rifle in 2 years, but as the heat pressed in that July morning, I felt the weight of it calling me back. And that was before the older one found her voice enough to tell me which way they'd gone. The girls stirred under the blanket not long after the sun broke over the ridge, their hair matted from dust and sweat, eyes blinking against the dim light inside my cabin. I moved slow, not wanting to startle them, setting a tin cup of water within reach. The older one, Missy, watched every motion, her small hand never leaving her sister's shoulder. Only when the younger girl pushed herself upright did Missy reach for the cup, tipping it carefully so they could drink together. Their clothes were torn, feet blistered, rope marks raw against their wrists. Whoever had sent them this way hadn't done it gently. I set a bowl of broth on the bed's edge and stepped back. They ate in small, cautious bites, glancing toward the door as if expecting it to open. When Missy's eyes finally met mine, they were steady, not the eyes of a child who scared easy. "Mama's still with them," she said. Her voice was quiet, but each word carried its own weight. I asked how far. She lifted a finger west. 3 nights' ride. We ran. She cut the rope, told us not to look back. I kept my tone even. How many? She didn't hesitate. 10, maybe more. They take women, tie them up, beat them, sell them. Talia drew her knees to her chest, eyes on the floor. I'd heard talk of men like that, drifters left mean by the war, riding the border country for whatever they could take. I stepped outside to let my thoughts settle. The hills to the west lay quiet in the heat, nothing moving but a lone hawk circling high. I'd told myself I was done chasing down trouble, but the promise I made to myself the day before the girls arrived had already started to crack. Under the lean-to, I pulled back the tarp covering my old rifle case. The Spencer repeater lay clean and oiled inside, untouched for years. Beside it sat my Colt Navy revolver, the grips worn smooth, the steel still true. I loaded both without hurry, the motions as familiar as they'd been during the war. When I stepped back inside, Missy's eyes went straight to the gun belt. "You going to bring her back?" she asked. My answer was plain. "I'm going to try." I packed jerky, a canteen, and enough cartridges to matter. Before I left, I set out extra bread and water where the girls could reach them. "If I'm not back in 3 days, ride north. Find a man named Ford Hanley. Tell him I sent you." Missy didn't nod, just kept her gaze locked on mine. That kind of stillness in a child sits with a man longer than most things. The mule's hooves struck a slow, steady rhythm as I crossed the first dry wash west of the cabin. There were no real roads through this part of the borderlands, just game trails, old boot tracks, and washes that might hold water after a storm. I kept off the open ground, letting Tucker pick his way through the mesquite. Within the hour, I found the track's small pony prints unshod alongside several sets of boot marks. One print dragged the right leg slightly. Another man smoked cheroots, leaving stubs crushed into the dirt. They were moving in a loose spread, not worried about being followed. By midday, the heat was enough to drive a man slow. The air lay heavy, no wind, no bird calls. That kind of quiet means something out here. In the Badlands, I spotted a scrap of brown deerskin snagged on a thorn, the beaded fringe dark with dried blood. Apache work, likely torn from a dress. I folded it into my pocket and kept on. The trail led into a shallow canyon where the walls rose in red stone layers. From a ledge, I saw them 7 men encamped, their horses tied along a fallen log, a thin line of smoke rising from a cook fire. 2 more stood watch on the ridge, one pacing the other, leaning on his rifle. And there she was, Neva, tied upright to a post in the center, wrists bound above her head, dress-torn face marked with fresh bruises. She shifted her weight, eyes scanning without moving her head. I stayed until dark, watching the guards change, counting the weapons, finding the quietest way through. When the younger sentry's head began to nod, I slid down the back side of the bluff, landing soft on the sand. My knife was in my hand as I moved between the shadows of their patched tents. The horses stirred but didn't call out. Neva saw me approach, her eyes fixing on mine. She didn't cry out or fight when I cut the leather. Her arms fell free, and I caught her before she could collapse. We moved slow, weaving between the tents. A man rolled over in his blanket but didn't wake. We were almost to the edge of camp when a horse stamped, snapping a twig. The older sentry's voice cut through the dark. I told Neva to run. My rifle came up, one shot dropping him before the sound finished echoing. Shouts followed, men scrambling for rifles, boots pounding dirt. We kept low, the ridge ahead, our only cover. Bullets slapped rock dust, stinging our eyes. Neva stumbled once, but I kept her, moving my arm firm around her waist. We made the ridge, crossed into the shadow of a narrow draw 2 miles west, the creek bed dry and twisting. Only when the shouts faded did we stop. She bent over, breathing hard. I gave her the canteen, just enough to wet her mouth. "They're alive," I said. "Your girls? At my cabin?" Her hand covered her mouth for a moment, then fell away. She nodded once, eyes on the dark beyond the draw. Neither of us spoke after that. The night was cold, but the ground was solid underfoot. We kept moving until the horizon paled. When the sun came up, we found a low basin with a cottonwood near the center and an old lean-to I'd built years ago. It wasn't much, but it was hidden. Niva sat on the bench, her ankles' swollen knuckles scraped. I gave her jerky and the last of the boiled water. She asked my name, said hers, and then told me about heading south to find her mother's kin near the border. They'd stopped to rest. The men came in the night. She fought, killed one with a rock, and they beat her for it. By the time she finished, the fire between us had burned down to coals. She leaned against the log wall and closed her eyes. I let her rest and scouted the area, finding no fresh tracks. The bandits weren't following, not yet. When I returned, she was sitting up, arms wrapped around her knees. "Why help us?" she asked. My answer was the same as it had been to her daughter. Because no one came for mine. We left the lean-to before the heat set in, crossing a stretch of open desert with the sun at our backs. She walked without asking for help, even on the loose gravel. When we paused in the shade of a jagged outcrop, she asked if the girls looked like her. I told her the truth, especially the older one. She smiled just barely before it faded again. By midday, we'd covered good ground. I led her to a cache I'd buried years earlier, a tin of beans, a half-full flask, a single match wrapped in cloth. We ate in silence, the canyon walls holding the heat around us. She didn't take more than I did. When the sun lowered, we reached the last ridge before the land opened toward home. I could almost see the cabin in my mind. We camped at the bluff that night, the fire small but warm against the cooling air. Niva sat close, her hands folded in her lap, the light catching the curve of her cheek. She didn't speak much, and neither did I. Tomorrow, if we kept pace, she'd see her daughters again. We broke camp with the first light the fire doused, and the blanket folded tight in my pack. The air was cool at that hour, though the sun was already brushing the ridge to the east. Niva walked close, her braid tied with a strip of leather, her steps careful on the loose gravel. She hadn't asked how far we had left, only kept her eyes forward as the land opened into a long stretch of sage and low red hills. Tucker plodded behind us with the pack and canteen, his ears twitching at every shift in the breeze. By mid-morning, we reached the rise I knew would give us the first view of my cabin. The red cliffs held it in their shadow stone walls, low under a roof of weathered pine smoke curling thin from the stovepipe. I stopped at the crest, letting her take it in. She stood still for a long moment, the muscles in her jaw tightening. From where we stood, the pen beside the cabin looked quiet, the mule's head bent to graze. A figure moved in the doorway, small and barefoot, and then another in the window. Misi stepped out onto the porch, a broom in her hand, her braid hanging loose. She spotted us, her face narrowing against the sunlight, then changing as she recognized her mother. She didn't call out, didn't rush forward. She simply stepped aside, leaving the doorway open. Niva walked the last yards without looking back at me. Inside, Talia sat cross-legged on the floor with a rag doll. She froze when she saw her mother, then leapt to her feet, the doll tumbling away. Both girls were in her arms before I reached the porch. I didn't follow them in. The door closed on its own, and I walked to the side of the cabin, checking the water barrel and the wood stack. The sound of their voices carried faintly through the wall, muffled words in their own tongue, the rise and fall of relief. The chores steadied my hands, and I left them the time they needed. When Niva stepped outside again, her shoulders were straighter. The fear I'd seen in her face days earlier had eased, though it hadn't vanished. She said the girls wanted to know if they were staying. I told her they could stay as long as they wished. She said they wouldn't eat for free. I told her they didn't owe me anything, but she carried a small armload of cut wood to the porch without another word. Inside, the girls had begun a soft song, something older than the road they'd just traveled. That evening, I made rabbit stew in the pot over the fire. The girls ate near the hearth, their knees drawn up, eyes heavy but content. Niva sat at the table, her ribs wrapped with a strip torn from one of my shirts. She didn't speak much, but she watched them with a focus that didn't waver. When they fell asleep curled together under a blanket, I cleared the bowls. She stayed seated, her hands resting on the table's edge. She said I could have turned them away. I said I hadn't. She asked why. I told her I was tired of living for nobody. We laid a second blanket on the bed that night, enough for all three of them. She helped me smooth the corners, her hand brushing mine. Neither of us moved away. Something settled in the air between us, then quiet but sure. The days that followed took on a pattern without much talk. I worked the south fence before the heat rose, the rails needing mending from the last hard wind. Neva swept the porch, boiled water for washing, and combed the dust from the girl's hair. Misi took to helping her in the kitchen, peeling potatoes with a small knife. Talia liked to follow me into the yard, pointing out loose boards or hens hiding under the wagon. Their wariness faded. They didn't hush their voices when I walked into a room. By the third day, the bruises on Neva's arms had turned from deep purple to yellow at the edges. The cut above her brow had closed, leaving a thin scar she didn't hide. She began to hum while she worked low tunes in her own language, and I let them fill the quiet. One evening, I came in from the barn carrying a saddle with a torn girth. She stood at the stove stirring the pot, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. The girls were already eating. I set the saddle on the table and she turned toward me. "Need it stitched?" she asked. I nodded. She wiped her hands on a cloth and took the saddle, threading her needle with practiced hands. Her stitches were even and tight. She said her aunt had taught her to sew for trade goods when she was a girl. I told her she was good at it. She said she had to be. A long pause settled, the kind where the fire's crackle is the only sound. Then she asked if I still expected those men to come back. I said I'd be a fool not to. She kept sewing but nodded at that. "You're not easy prey," she said. I told her things had changed now with her and the girls here. Her fingers hesitated on the leather before moving again. When the girls were in bed, she stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool, the stars sharp above the ridge. I joined her a few minutes later, my hands still smelling faintly of pine from the fence posts. She said the place didn't feel temporary anymore. I told her she didn't have to decide right away. She looked at me and said she already had. The next morning came without warning, a change in the air, a low thud of hooves on hard ground. From the window I saw dust rising on the trail and 3 riders coming fast. The riders came in hard, their mounts throwing up dust as they cut across the yard. From the window, I counted 3 all armed, spreading wide as they closed the distance. I moved from the glass to the stove, pulling up the trap door that led to the root cellar. Now, I told Neva. She had the girls moving before I finished the word, guiding them down into the dark space, pulling the wool blanket over them to keep the light out. I told her to stay with them, but she shook her head. "I stay with you," she said, her voice low but steady. There was no time to argue. I stepped outside to the side of the cabin, taking position behind the woodpile, my rifle braced. Neva knelt just inside the doorway, loading the Colt with hands that didn't shake. The riders slowed when they saw the cabin, one of them raising a hand. "We don't want the kids," he called out, "just the woman. Give her up and we ride off." I didn't answer. Another voice followed sharper, carrying across the yard. "You killed 3 of ours. You think we forget?" The distance closed to 30 yards. I drew in a breath, sighted on the man in the lead, and fired. The shot dropped him clean from the saddle. The other 2 kicked their horses into motion, returning fire. Bullets hit the porch post, splintering wood. I kept low, moving along the side of the house. Neva stepped out once, quick as a shadow, and fired twice. One shot missed. The second struck the rider on the left, pitching him forward over the horn before he fell to the dirt. The last man wheeled his horse and ran, the sound of hooves fading fast. I lowered the rifle. "Let him go," I said, my breath still hard in my chest. Neva came to my side, her eyes on my arm. A crease of red showed through my shirt sleeve where a bullet had grazed me. "It's nothing," I told her. She reached for my hand anyway, gripping it tight for a moment. From inside the cabin came the sound of the trap door creaking. Two small voices called out. Neva ran to lift the hatch, pulling the girls into the light. They looked at the broken wood, the blood in the dirt, then back to their mother. "It's over," she told them. "We're safe now." That evening I dug the graves far from the cabin, marking each with a single stone. Neva made stew from dried corn and the last of the meat we had on hand. She hummed as she worked the sound low and even different than before. At the table, the girls sat on either side of me, laughing when the cornbread crumbled too soon under my knife. Talia leaned into my arm when her eyes grew heavy. Missy sat braiding a piece of twine until she tied it around my wrist without asking. Neva watched it all without saying much, but there was a change in her face, a quiet shift like something heavy had been set down. When the girls went to bed, I stepped outside to the porch. The air was still warm, the night calm. She joined me after a moment, standing close enough that her shoulder brushed mine. "I've been thinking," she said, "about staying, not just for now, for good." I looked at her. Her eyes didn't move away. The girls don't need the road anymore. They need a home. My voice felt rough in my throat, but I told her, "Then this is it." She reached into her pocket, pulling out the strip of leather she used to tie her braid, and wrapped it beside the twine on my wrist. "You gave us safety," she said, "but we want more than that. We want you." I stepped closer, my hands brushing her arms. "You have me," I said quietly. "You've had me since they rode into my land." She leaned into my chest, and I held her there as the stars came out. Somewhere inside, the girls stirred, then settled again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man standing alone. The morning after the shooting, the cabin felt different. The girls moved freely from the hearth to the porch, their voices light as they played with bits of twine and scraps of cloth. Neva was at the table mending one of my shirts, the leather tie still knotted around her braid. I worked outside, setting the south gate back on its hinges, the hammer ringing steady in the cool air. The graves I'd dug the night before were out of sight beyond the bluff, and no dust showed on the horizon. By midday, the chores brought me back to the porch, where Neva had set a small pot to boil over the outdoor fire. She ladled stew into bowls for the girls and sent them inside to eat, then sat on the step with her own. "Feels different here now," she said after a while. I nodded, setting my plate beside me. The quiet between us wasn't heavy, just settled like a space that no longer needed filling. The afternoon passed in small work, splitting kindling, checking the lines in the smokehouse. Neva joined me in the yard to hang laundry, her hands wringing water from each piece before pinning it to the rope. The breeze picked up just enough to sway the cloth, carrying the scent of soap and pine. When the last shirt was hung, she stayed beside me, watching the hills. That evening, I found her in the barn, checking the mule's hooves. She looked up when I stepped inside. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. I told her there was always a chance, but not soon. Her eyes held mine for a moment before she nodded and went back to her work. 2 days later, I rode into Mesilla for supplies. It had been months since I'd spent more than an hour in town, and the change in pace felt sharp. I bought flour, salt, and coffee along with a new tin for carrying water. At the counter, I heard low talk from 2 ranch hands about trouble in the border country, raids on camp's livestock, taking people missing. Their eyes slid toward me, but they didn't speak my name. When I returned, Neva was in the yard with the girls, showing them how to braid strips of cloth into a rope. They ran to take the pack from my hands, carrying it to the table with practiced care. That night we ate biscuits fresh from the skillet, the girls proud to have helped mix and roll the dough. The days grew warmer, the light stretching longer into the evening. I began working on a small addition to the cabin, a lean-to room that could hold a bed and a table, giving the girls their own space. Neva helped carry boards from the stack by the shed, holding each in place while I hammered. We spoke little during the work, but the rhythm of it felt sure. One evening as the sun set, Neva stood at the edge of the yard, her braid loose over one shoulder. She was watching the ridge, though there was nothing there. I joined her, my hands in my pockets. "I used to think about where we'd go," she said, her eyes still on the horizon. "Now I think about what we can make here." The next morning I saddled Tucker and took him down to the creek for water. The air was cool, the surface of the water still. I filled the canteens, letting the mule drink his fill before heading back up the trail. Halfway to the cabin, I caught sight of movement on the far ridge, a single rider too far to make out clearly heading east. I kept my pace steady, but the sight stayed with me. At the cabin, I set the canteens inside and told Neva what I'd seen. She glanced toward the hills, then went back to kneading dough. "Could be nothing," she said, but her shoulders had stiffened. That evening, we ate in near silence, the girls chattering between themselves. When they were in bed, Neva joined me on the porch. The air had cooled, carrying the smell of mesquite from the far side of the bluff. "If they do come back," she said quietly, "we'll be ready." Her tone wasn't fearful, just certain. I looked out over the dark yard, the fence lines, the stretch of open ground beyond. Somewhere in that quiet, I knew she was right. By the next morning, the air felt heavy, the kind that makes a man listen harder to the space between sounds. I worked the fence along the east side of the property, while Neva kept the girls close to the cabin. They were gathering mesquite pods in a small basket, stopping now and then to sort the best from the brittle. From where I stood, I could hear the low hum of their voices, mixing with the creak of the gate as I tested its hinges. Around midday, I noticed Neva's gaze fixed west. She stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes narrowing. "There," she said quietly when I came up beside her. On the far ridge, a rider was cutting across the horizon. The shape was too far to tell much, but the horse moved like it knew the land, keeping a steady line toward the low pass. We watched until the figure dropped out of sight. "Could be a ranch hand passing through," I said. She didn't answer, just turned back inside. The rest of the afternoon carried a restlessness that didn't break. I finished the fence work, but stayed within sight of the cabin. That evening, while the girls shelled beans at the table, Neva joined me on the porch. If it was one of them, she said he wasn't in a hurry. Her voice held no fear, only the matter-of-fact tone she used when weighing something in her mind. I told her we'd keep an eye on the ridge at first light. She agreed and went back inside to tend the fire. The next day, I saddled Tucker and rode a slow loop around the property, checking the washes and gullies that fed into our land. No fresh tracks showed close, but in the sandy soil near the old cottonwood, I found a single hoof print deep with the edge still sharp enough to catch the morning light. It was newer than anything else in that stretch. When I got back, Neva was teaching the girls to mend a tear in one of their dresses. She looked up as I stepped in. "Something?" she asked. I told her about the track and where I'd found it. She nodded, tied off the stitch, and set the dress aside. "They might be looking for an opening," she said. The rest of the week we worked in quiet readiness. I checked the rifle and Colt each morning, kept water and dry goods close to the door. Neva stored extra firewood inside and moved the girls' bedding so they could be in the cellar within seconds if needed. The girls noticed the change, but didn't ask questions, following our lead without complaint. On the fifth day, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of wood smoke that wasn't ours. It was gone as quickly as it came, but it was enough. I walked the ridge that evening, scanning the line where the sky met the land. Nothing showed, but the silence had weight to it. When I came back, Neva was on the porch, her shawl pulled tight against the cooling air. "We'll sleep light tonight," she said. I agreed. Inside, we let the fire burn lower than usual, the light dim enough not to show through the windows. The girls fell asleep together under one blanket, their breathing even. Sometime after midnight, a coyote called from the far hills. I sat in the chair by the door with the rifle across my lap, listening for anything beneath the sound. The minutes stretched, broken only by the faint creak of the boards as Neva stepped from the bedroom. She moved to the window, looked out into the dark, then came to stand beside me. No words passed between us. We both knew the waiting had begun. The night stretched long and still. I sat in the chair by the door, rifle across my lap, eyes shifting between the window and the faint glow from the stove. Neva stayed near the girls, but every so often I'd see her shadow move across the wall, checking the shutters or looking out into the yard. The wind had died, leaving the kind of quiet where every board creak and shift of the logs in the fire carried. Just before dawn, I caught the sound, soft at first, then clearer hoofbeats, slow and deliberate. I set the rifle down long enough to lift the edge of the curtain. A lone rider came into view at the far end of the yard, not hurrying, not calling out. The horse stopped a dozen yards from the porch, the man sitting easy in the saddle, a wide brim hat shadowing most of his face. "Morning," he called. His voice was even, but it carried. I didn't answer, waiting for him to say more. "Looking for someone came through here," he went on. "A woman and 2 children. Neva stepped into the room behind me, her eyes fixed on the rider. I could feel the stillness in her, the way she didn't draw breath until I spoke. "No one here like that," I said. "You've got the wrong place." The man leaned forward on his horn, studying the cabin, his gaze flicking to the woodpile and the barn before coming back to me. "If you do see them," he said, "tell them Roy Hanley is looking." He turned his horse without another word, heading back the way he came. I stayed at the window until he was a speck against the pale light, then gone altogether. Neva moved to the table, her hands gripping the edge. "That name," she said quietly. "I've heard it before." We spent the rest of the day on edge, keeping the girls close and the rifle loaded. The chores still needed doing, but I didn't stray far from the cabin. In the afternoon, I walked the ridge, scanning for any sign of him or others. The land was empty, the only tracks those of a single horse passing north. That evening, as the sun fell, the girls sat on the porch steps, playing with a small ball of twine. Neva and I stayed standing, watching the horizon. "He wasn't here by chance," she said. I agreed. "If he comes back," I told her, "we won't wait for him to make the first move." The wind picked up again after dark, carrying the dry scent of the high country. I checked the latch on the cellar door, the water barrel, the barn. Every sound in the night felt closer, every shadow longer. We were ready, but readiness and calm are not the same. By morning, no riders had come, but the sense of waiting hadn't lifted. The girls went about their morning as they always did, helping Neva with the wash, feeding the hens, but their eyes cut to the window whenever a bird startled or the mule shifted in the pen. After supper, I sat at the table cleaning the rifle, while Neva mended a tear in Talia's dress. The lamp burned low, throwing a soft light over the room. "This won't end until one of us ends it," she said, her voice steady. I met her eyes and knew she was right. That night, when I stepped onto the porch, the moon was just past full, lighting the yard in silver. Somewhere out there, Roy Hanley knew exactly what he was looking for. By the second morning after Roy Hanley's visit, the wind carried a sharper bite, and the clouds moved low and fast across the ridgeline. I was out by the barn, pitchfork in hand, when I heard the crunch of hooves on frozen earth. This time, it wasn't a lone rider. Sheriff Colton and 2 deputies rode in their mounts, puffing steam in the cold air. Colton swung down slow, his boots sinking into the dirt. "We found Hanley," he said, voice low. "North trail near the canyon. He won't trouble you again." I met his eyes, reading the weight behind the words. Whatever had happened out there, it was finished. Inside, Neva stood by the stove, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. I told her what Colton said, and she let out a breath I hadn't known she was holding. The girls were in the corner, bent over their lessons, the firelight catching in their hair. For the first time in weeks, their shoulders weren't tight with listening for every sound outside. That evening, Colton stopped back with a folded document. "It's the deed," he said, placing it on the table. "Signed over proper. This land's yours outright now, no claims, no disputes." My fingers rested on the rough paper, feeling the weight of it more than the words. The days that followed settled into a quieter rhythm. Neva took the girls to the creek to gather smooth stones for the garden border. I repaired the south fence and oiled the hinges on the barn doors. Each night we ate by lantern light, the air inside warm and safe. One Sunday we rode into town together for the first time. Folks who had kept their distance before now tipped their hats or offered a hand. At the church social, the girls played with the other children, and Neva spoke with the women about the planting season. It struck me then how far we'd come from that first night, when fear sat in every shadow. Out here, justice doesn't always come quick, and it doesn't always come clean. But when it does, it's like the ground steadying under your boots after a long ride. We had our home, our land, and the kind of peace you don't take for granted. If you've listened this far, I hope you'll carry this with you on the frontier. Blood might make you kin, but trust and kindness make you family. And family, however it's found, is worth standing your ground for. Thank you for sitting with me through this tale. If it settled something in your own heart, maybe share it with someone who needs to hear it.